From the news team at LinkedIn, I'm Jessi Hempel, and this is Hello Monday. In the mid-1990s, hush puppies were this brand of shoe that were on the brink of death. Sales had slowed to a trickle. The company was about to discontinue them altogether when some fashion-forward kids in downtown New York started wearing them as a fashion statement, to be ironic. Fashion designers began featuring them. Celebrities like Princess Di started wearing them. And by 1995, these shoes were a wardrobe staple. Today's guest, Malcolm Gladwell, would say that they hit a tipping point. This was a chief example in the book that he released a quarter century ago now, The Tipping Point. His core idea was that small, seemingly inconsequential actions or trends can trigger massive, transformative change when they reach the right people. He called them connectors, mavens, and salespeople. These were people who spread the idea to a broader audience. Now, a lot has changed in 25 years. For one, you probably don't have a landline, and you definitely have an email address. So how does that change how ideas themselves spread? It's the question Malcolm's asked in his newest book, Revenge of the Tipping Point, Overstories, Superspreaders, and the Rise of Social Engineering. In it, Malcolm makes a bold admission. He didn't get it all right the first time around. Now, Malcolm and I recorded this conversation for a live broadcast earlier this fall. If you happen to be a LinkedIn Premium member, you can watch it. Just check out our show notes for a link. And I'm sure you're going to hear me call in some of the viewers for questions as you listen today. The broadcast adds this certain energy to the whole thing. I bet you'll hear that too. It was fun. More after this. And we're back. We're living in this era of influencers. And by influencers, I mean people who've built a following, a voice that other people trust when it comes to trends and ideas. The power of that influence is undeniable. But what does it really mean? Here's Malcolm.
I think influence used to mean expertise. And I think that's a little bit diminished. And now influence means, who knows, any number of things. It's people who are relatable to us, but, bigger versions of ourselves. It's people who have a degree of celebrity that excites us. I think it's kind of, that word has splintered into 5 or 6 different categories.
Well, isn't expertise in some ways the 20th century expression of influence, simply because the question of distribution, how the expertise got out there, was answered? It was moot. You didn't need to worry about it. Yeah. Whereas today, that's kind of the central question.
Yeah. No, I think that is true. I think it's a steadily expanding. I also think that the word influence used to have a kind of timestamp attached to it, that you needed to have influence over a period of time to be thought of as influential. And now I think it's a lot spikier.
Spikier, and the spikes move fast, it feels to me.
And the spikes move fast.
In this new book, The Revenge of the Tipping Point, you are revisiting material that you first considered, 25 years ago now. Almost. I don't want to make it older than it is.
It's 25.
Yeah, it's 25 years. Okay. So I'd love to know a little bit about how the idea of influence has changed beyond what we were talking about. What's new?
Well, I could start by saying that what's not new is how profoundly asymmetrical patterns of influence are. So I talk about this in my new book, in my old book, The Original Tipping Point. I had that idea of the law of the few, which was that epidemics are generated by a tiny number of people at the margins. And I returned to that, and now I think it's even more, what the modern world has done is made that kind of pattern even more asymmetrical.
Yeah.
Many epidemics have what I call the radical asymmetry, which is that an incredibly small number of people do the job of transmitting the virus. So if you look at COVID, for example, we now realize that the people who spread COVID were probably less than 5% of the population, who for genetic reasons just produce so much more virus than the rest of us. The whole story of transmission was about a tiny number of people at the very, very fringes. And I think that is also true of epidemics of ideas. And I think one of the things that social media and the rise of the digital age has done is to make that pattern even more asymmetrical.
Asymmetrical, but also to some degree erratic. I mean, I think the question that everybody likely has, the reason we're tuning in, is because we want to know how to be one of those small numbers of people with our own ideas, and also how to identify those small numbers of people in our own organization. I've heard you speak about how Steve Jobs chose a certain group of people within Apple, right? To take away every year. And they weren't the people at the top of the org chart. They were the people he identified as the people who moved ideas. Where are those people in our organizations?
Well, we're talking here about social power as opposed to institutional power. And I think the first observation, which is the one that Jobs was following up on, is that there is some overlap between social power and institutional power, but it's not 100%. In other words, these are separate domains that people can play crucial roles in spreading ideas in institutions, and that job, that task they are doing, does not necessarily represent itself in an org chart, is not necessarily recognized and rewarded by their bosses. It's a thing over here.
Right.
And that makes it very difficult, of course, to identify who those people are, because it's not a simple matter of just looking at the hierarchy of an organization.
Many of us also are those people in our own organizations who are trying to move an idea, to advance an idea. And particularly with the erratic nature of the movement of ideas today, this question actually comes from someone in our audience, from Vanessa in Mission, Kansas. She asks, how can you be influential, but also stick to your ethics and vision and essentially move an idea for the idea's sake, not for the fact that you think this is an idea that because it's radical or bold will get attention?
Yeah. Well, this is one of the questions that was top of mind for me when I decided to return to the tipping point and write this new book, Revenge of the Tipping Point. I became more and more concerned that a lot of epidemic principles were being used by people and not for the good of society, for their own personal ends. It is not the case, unfortunately, that only good ideas spread, right? The quality that makes an idea spread is independent of its virtue.
Right.
And so I think we need to be absolutely alert for people who are malignant operators in the field of ideas. We were just talking about Purdue Pharma. Purdue Pharma, when they were marketing OxyContin that set off the opioid crisis, it was one of the most brilliant marketing campaigns in the history of modern pharma. I mean, it is so far ahead, a generation ahead of what everyone else was thinking about. It happened to have the effect of creating an epidemic that now claims over 100,000 lives a year in the United States. So, you can do something brilliant and it's not helping society.
It was an effective spread of an idea that turned out to be an incredibly harmful idea.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting, even as we're talking about this, I think in the sort of window of time following your publication of the original Tipping Point, social media came onto the scene. And our first iteration of a cultural understanding of those platforms had to do with doing good. We used terms like democratization and people are going to be able to do good at scale. Now, if you follow the cultural narrative about how we talk about what's happened to those platforms, you arrive at this moment, which is that collectively, I think everybody would agree, you can spread a lot of bad ideas quickly as well, and that is a problem. But in either moment, we are ascribing to the dominant paradigm of belief around the system. Help us to back up and think about digital platforms and the role that digital tools play in influence.
Yeah. At the height of the kind of enthusiasm over Twitter, which was 2008, the Arab Spring Revolution, when people thought that Twitter was going to single-handedly bring democracy to the Middle East, Twitter and Facebook. And I remember writing a piece for the New Yorker magazine called The Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted, in which I was like, guys, this is nuts. This is not. And I got an extraordinary amount of criticism for that piece. And I think in the end, I was borne out to be correct. These platforms, they are simply energy. They can be moved. They can be put to good purposes or bad purposes. They don't have an inherent value. What I will say, with respect to social media is we're really, really early in the evolution of these tools. And if you look through history, whenever there's a new communication tool introduced,
Right.
it takes a very long time to figure out how to use it. My favorite example is the telephone is invented in the 1870s. For the first 45 years of the telephone's existence, telephone companies tried to discourage what they called trivial use of the telephone, which is what they meant was gossip.
Right.
You do not call your mom. That's basically that's not what it's for. It's for calling the corner store to see if they have flour. They thought it was a straight ahead business tool. They totally didn't get it. And it took society. This notion that you could call someone on a telephone from, talk to them remotely, was so new and so radical and so disruptive that the technology predated the understanding of how to use the technology. And I could go on, this is one of my favorite kind of riffs.
Right.
You can go on, and there's multiple examples of this where we get something long before we figure out what we want from that thing. And all of which is to say that Facebook, Twitter, all these things, X, I guess, Snapchat, what have you, TikTok, are all in their infancy.
Yep.
It doesn't feel like it, but they really are in their infancy. And I think the only thing we can say with certainty is a generation now, we will not use any of them in the way that we're using them now.
So Henry from New York has a question about AI. It's sort of an advancement of this question, right? Like, what is the technology everyone is talking about right now? Well, it's AI. So what are your greatest hopes and concerns for AI? And are you kind of thinking about it in the same way?
Well, I think the most useful way to think about AI's costs and benefits is to take the developed world out of the equation. Mm. So it's very clarifying to say, okay, let's remove Europe, North America, and let's just think about, my family's half Jamaican. Let's think about Jamaica. Let's think about Nigeria. Let's think about, what could it mean for those places? And I think the answer is for those places, it could be, there's way more upside than there is potential downside.
Yeah.
We're talking about giving economies that are a generation behind access to cutting edge knowledge, strategy. I mean, think of a subsistence farmer in equatorial Africa who can now go on his phone and get world-class advice about tailored to his exact place and time and crop choice and about how to be a more effective farmer. I mean, or somebody who's never had world-class medical care before, who can talk to a bot about their kid is desperately sick, they're miles from a hospital, they go on their phone and those are game-changing technologies. I sort of feel like the worries and grumbling we have here strike me as it's really kind of rich people's problems. I think the upside is so great outside of the West that's what we should be focusing on.
And yet it is also true that AI comes with a whole host of consequences we haven't thought through yet as a society. Even if these are rich people's problems, you still are largely optimistic about the opportunity.
I am. There is always this concern with every major technological disruption that it's going to wipe out employment for.
Right.
And what always happens is that, no, it's not that we get rid of a whole series of professions. We create new ones around the new technology. When cars were first introduced at the beginning of the 20th century, people counted up the number of people who were necessary for for horses and buggies. It was an astonishing number of people who were in the business of serving the horse as the engine of transportation. And there was this fear, like, what are those people going to do? Well, the answer is what they ended up doing was getting absorbed into the business of taking care of the car.
I love that example. And also, I would introduce the idea that it doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of pain for a lot of people on the path through the change. Yes. And a lot of us are on the path through the change right now.
Yes, I think that is absolutely the case. I don't think it is painless. I do think that if we're smart about it, it can be a lot less painful than it would be otherwise.
Yeah.
And I also think, think about a doctor. When I go to my doctor's office now, or a better example would be my mom, who's in her 90s, goes to the doctor more than I do, right? What she wants from her doctor is time. And that's the one thing her doctor can't give her, right? AI comes along. One version of it, AI comes along, and we just get rid of lots of doctors, replace them with bots, save a lot of money. And the other version is AI comes along, we keep the doctors we have and keep the nurses we have, and we just shift responsibilities, and all of a sudden doctors see you for 20 minutes and not 5.
Yeah.
Right? That's a choice
that
we will have as a society. And my hope is that we make I would like us to see, I think the world is an immeasurably better place if my mom's doctor sees her for 20 minutes as opposed to 5.
There's a middle path, which is the technology saves all the time. The doctor has the extra time and so fits in 3 patients instead of expanding the time with your mom.
So there's a variety of paths. Yes.
But generally, I hear and welcome what you're saying. We're going to take a quick break here. More from Malcolm Gladwell when we're back. And we're back. In his new book, Malcolm identifies the significance of storytelling, and he introduces this idea of the overstory. I wanted to know why the stories we tell carry so much weight. You spend a lot of time in your new book considering something that's very important to me, and that is the importance of storytelling. Mm-hmm. Storytelling is actually potentially more important in this environment that we're in today, right?
Yes. I was trying to get at this question of why do we see such extraordinary variation in patterns of things like professional behavior? Like, why do doctors in one town behave so dramatically different from doctors in another? I was looking at Medicare fraud. It's a whole chapter on Medicare fraud.
I'll never see Miami this way.
You'll never see Miami. Yeah, no. It's focused on Miami, asking the same question. Medicare fraud, which is one of the biggest problems this country faces, biggest category of fraud, is not the same in every city in the country. In fact, in some cities in the United States, Medicare fraud is so low as to be almost trivial. And in other places like Miami, it's off the charts. It's 50x more or whatever. Why is there this much variation? I think it has to do with the nature of the stories that we tell ourselves. Mm-hmm. The culture is created, very specific cultures are created by patterns of storytelling, of shared values, of narratives that govern the way people behave in ways they may not even be aware of. And I call these things the overstory. The overstory is the canopy layer at the top of the forest.
I married a camp counselor. I've heard a lot about overstory because it's so key. It's such a key component to nature, right?
And we're not always aware of it. The overstory casts a shadow on everything underneath. Yeah. It really determines who thrives and who doesn't. But how often do we look up and realize, everything I'm doing is being influenced by what's going on up there?
Right.
And that's the idea I was trying to get at with. It did give me, even as someone who tells story for a living, that whole exploration of storytelling and revenge made me kind of take a step back and say, maybe what I do is more important than I realize.
Well, I think I had not really considered the degree to which location is connected to the stories you tell. I had thought about a story as more sort of key or core to my belief about myself, and therefore I would carry it with me. This is a conversation that comes from Alice in Atlanta, Georgia. It's right along this path. She wants to know how leaders can create better conditions through storytelling. Essentially, we know companies do better when leaders can shape that culture a bit.
Yeah, so this, I thought of this the other day when I was chatting with a friend of mine about the company where they work, and they had just had a round they'd let some people go. Oof. And one of the people they let go was someone whose job had become, whose formal position had become less and less relevant. And so both he and the others had been predicting that he might not survive the next round of cuts. But my friend was saying, this guy played an informal role in a company that was extremely important. He counseled everyone. He helped out everyone. He was this kind of glue between different social groups in the company. He was the guy you went to for advice. So the question was, how do leaders create these kinds of stories? One of the ways they do that is by valuing the roles. So this guy was the company storyteller in a certain way,
Yeah.
right? He was the guy who put some meaning into what it meant for this group of people to come together every day. And if you were someone who wanted to change the meaning of the company, he would be the guy you would use.
Right.
He was someone everyone respected, trusted. He talked to everyone. He wasn't intimidating. He wasn't way up here. He was.
Right.
So, being alert to these kinds of social roles that employees play is a really important part of maintaining the power to change story. Because it's not enough just to declare,
Right.
we're all going to be about this now. You have to have a mechanism for delivering that message.
I feel like what I'm hearing you say, and tell me if this isn't quite right, that maybe as a leader, telling the story is not about gathering everybody in the room and saying, hey, this is the story, but about identifying the people in your organization who naturally come to it for whatever reason and being able to see the values you hope to inspire within those people.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that that good leaders intuitively do this.
Yeah.
Is they have a feeling for who the people occupying these crucial positions within the company.
Right.
And they engage with them, probably even without knowing about it.
So Malcolm, you did spend all of this time with these ideas that you had spent time with a long time ago. And it got me to thinking about how important it is for all of us to be evolving our own ideas, rethinking them, examining them. What did it open up for you, both in this book and beyond this book?
Well, for this book, in my original Tipping Point, I had a chapter on the decline of crime in New York City.
Yeah.
And after rereading it after 25 years, I realized, I was wrong. And I actually did an episode of my podcast, Revisionist History, which was a kind of explanation of how wrong I was, why I was wrong, and what I think a more correct answer would be today. I think that that's a really useful practice. And I would encourage other people to do it. It's not nearly as hard as you think it is. You think you're going to lose face with other people in your circle if you say you were wrong. The opposite is true. Right. I think people actually appreciate it. It sets an example that I think is really wonderful and kind of freeing in an organization. So I would say, first of all, that process of self-correction and reevaluation is much, much easier than most people realize.
Are you talking about doing it for yourself, or are you talking about doing it for a larger audience? Well,
in my case, because I am someone who writes for an audience, I was doing it for the audience. I mean, that's why I did a podcast episode.
Malcolm, I don't think that's easy. I'm sorry. I'm just going to push back on this. To call yourself out as being wrong, particularly if you are anybody who is at the margins of society in any way, feels like it has a natural cost to it.
Well, there's a distinction. So in psychological research, there has been some work on this.
Yeah.
And what the social scientists say is saying that your ideas were wrong is different from admitting to a flaw in character. So the flaw in character is a really hard one. And that one, people are not nearly as forgiving because they see it as an indication that you might fall in the same way in the future.
Right.
Admitting that your ideas were wrong and that you've learned something different is something that strengthens you in the eyes of others. Yeah. So I do think if you keep that distinction, I don't mean that people should be discouraged from admitting to flaws of character, but one of those strategies is costly and one is not.
Yes.
So so we should at least recognize that it's not that they're all costly. I will say with 100% certainty, it is not costly for me to have done that podcast episode saying that the crime chapter in Tipping Point is wrong. No, it is, to the contrary, it is what establishes, or it's the only way I can establish credibility with my readers.
Well, and it speaks to something else, and it feels to me that by being willing to call out your ideas as flawed, you are essentially shoring up your authenticity.
Yeah.
Okay, so this question comes from Ash in Austin, Texas. Ash is wondering how you have influence if you aren't a person who has a big community in whatever it is you do.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether an important part of the definition of influence is scale. I think you can have really, really, if you think about my brother was a principal for many years in an elementary school. Within the four walls of his school was enormously influential,
Sure.
right? Now, that's with 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, right? So it's influence, and indirectly it had influence on those kids' parents, but it's really, he was influential among a group of a couple hundred 6 or 7-year-olds. That's not scale, that's not prestige, that's not, formal power in any sense of the word. It's still influence. Really.
I was just going to say, it depends on your community. Among those 6-year-olds, there is a path to prestige.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's true. But I think I don't think that we should rule out the idea that influence can be wielded in very, very non-traditional spaces, and is nonetheless important for that. I would rather have, I would rather send my kid to a school with a principal who had a clear vision and set of values that it impressed itself on those kids, even if that influence was never felt outside the walls of that school.
Any day. I
Yeah.
totally agree. Okay, so this question comes from Shokat in Dubai, who's got a question around confidence. I have to say, Malcolm, I consider you to be a very confident person because you appear to me to be a person who just puts your ideas out there. Not all of us feel that comfortable putting our ideas out there. Do you have any advice for folks who may be new to it or uncomfortable with it?
Yes, I do have advice. Shakat, I would say, one of the things that I do as a matter of practice is before I write anything, I work for Pushkin Audio, and we have what we call table reads, and we gather, say I've written a script for a podcast, we gather maybe, a dozen people from all over our company, but high up, low down, doesn't matter. We get together and they weigh in.
Yeah.
We read through it, and I open myself up to, at the very beginning it was a difficult thing to do, but then I realized, no, what I've done is I've created a very, very safe environment for getting feedback. Safe in two ways. One is I've made sure I've done it early enough in the process that I haven't already put a stake in the ground.
Sure.
So you got to start early. And two, you have to make sure that the people who are responding to you are well-intentioned.
Yeah.
You must trust them. They need to be aligned with the goal of making your ideas better. A lot of criticism is not well-intentioned.
Yeah.
And I think you need to recognize when it is not and avoid it. But those two principles, I think, are really, really important. Start early and expose your idea to people who are well-intentioned.
Yeah.
And that was an enormous confidence boost. When I finally publish a podcast or a book,
Yep.
it's been through enough iterations that I'm at least confident that I'm not embarrassing myself.
Well, so here you're speaking about sharing your ideas with an audience of friendlies. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so this question comes from Quebec, from Pierre Alexandre. What are the skills we should try to develop in our kids to prepare them for tomorrow's professional environment?
Really good question. As someone who has kids, I've thought about this a great deal. I think that people who are entering the workforce, 10 years from now or 15 years from now, need to be way more flexible.
Yeah.
In the choice of, you're going to have 4 or 5 careers. You're not going to have one. First of all, you're going to live a lot longer.
Right.
And secondly, the pace of change is going to be such that whole fields will be wiped out and new ones will be formed. You've got to be nimble. So that's a very different expectation. My generation, at least when we started, we thought this is what we were going to be doing for the rest of our lives.
Right.
Guy was just chatting with this recently retired police officer today who was in his early 40s becoming an airline pilot. Like, that's what I'm talking about. Like,
That's not even a weird story in the future that we are about to live into.
yeah,
That's
that should
the way
not be.
that life works.
But if you told me 30 years ago, if you talked to a police officer and you said, you're going to have a second career starting in your 40s as a commercial airline pilot, they would have said it's impossible.
That was Malcolm Gladwell, the author of Revenge of the Tipping Point, Overstories, Super Spreaders, and the Rise of Social Engineering. And if you're a LinkedIn Premium member and you want to actually watch that conversation instead of listening to it, check the show notes for a link. You know, there are quite a few things that I'm going to take away from this conversation. First, new technology like AI can create a lot of exciting opportunities and present a myriad of scary consequences. We know this to be the case, and Malcolm illustrates it beautifully. He makes the point that everything new gives us a lot of good and bad, but more than anything else, it offers us choice. So what will yours be? Second, influence isn't just about scale, right? It's about impact. You don't have to be a CEO or have 1 million followers to make an impact in your community. You know, I loved the example Malcolm shared about his brother, the elementary school principal. It made me think of Ellen Myers, the administrator at my own high school. I think about her and say her name just about every day. Now, isn't that a legacy you want? And last, stay nimble. Malcolm offered some advice to the younger generation that I think we could probably all benefit from. We've reached a moment in time where your job could change or even disappear, seemingly overnight. It helps us all when we learn to roll with the punches and adapt to new environments and skills. I'm not saying it is easy, but we know it's important. We're going to talk about all of this and more during office hours. Our senior producer, Sarah Storm, and I will go live on Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern from the LinkedIn news page. And if you have trouble finding us, you can just shoot us an email at hellomonday@linkedin.com and we'll send you a link. Hope to see you there. Hello Monday is a production of LinkedIn News. Lolia Briggs and Ava Ahmadbegi produced this episode with help from Rachel Karp. Sarah Storm is our senior producer, sound design and engineering by Asaf Gadron. Our theme music was composed just for us by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. Our contributor, Michaela Greer, is an original influencer. Enrique Montalvo is our executive producer. Dave Pond is head of production and creative operations. Courtney Coop is head of original programming. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. I'm Jessi Hempel. We're back next Monday. Thanks for listening.